Thank you for joining us today. I'm now going to turn the webinar over to Rebecca. Rebecca, do you want to start?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Saltzbaugh, and I'm with the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on domestic violence, and thank you all for joining us, taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar. Before we begin, I would just like to take a moment to introduce you to our presenters, Paul Feuerstein and Cynthia Amadeo from Barrier Free Living. Paul, the founder and president and CEO of Barrier Free Living New York City, developed the first transitional residence in the country for homeless individuals who also have severe disabilities. It was located on the Lower East Side of New York City. Barrier Free Living has the largest domestic violence program for people with disabilities in the country. Freedom House, the first totally accessible emergency domestic violence shelter in the country, has served victims with disabilities from over 40 states as well as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. In 2015, Barrier Free Living opened 120 units of supportive housing in the South Bronx. Paul has authored Disabled Women and Domestic Violence Notes from the Field for a textbook entitled Service Delivery for Vulnerable Populations, New Directions in Behavioral Health, as well as other articles. Cynthia Amadeo is a licensed mental health counselor who specializes in the intersection of domestic violence and disabilities. Her current role is as Barrier Free Living's Chief Program Officer, where she oversees all programming in the agency, including Freedom House, Secret Garden, and Barrier Free Living Apartments. Cynthia began as a children's counselor at Freedom House and has since held several leadership positions in the agency, including Coordinator of Family Services, Director of Family Services, and Director of Social Services. She regularly presents at domestic violence and trauma conferences nationally to spread awareness of how domestic violence impacts people with disabilities. Prior to working at Barrier Free Living, she counseled children infected and affected by HIV/AIDS, as well as survivors of the 2001 World Trade Center attack. I would like to thank Cynthia and Paul so very much for presenting today on such a very important topic. And with that, I will now turn the webinar over to them.
Thank you. We really appreciate your being supportive of our passion, which is working on the issue of domestic violence for people with disabilities. I started doing the work 34 years ago when I was interviewing a deaf woman who had just graduated from New York University's Deafness Rehabilitation Program to see about hiring her to be a counselor in our mental health program. And in the interview, she said, I have 13 years experience working with disabled victims of domestic violence. And in my head, I was going, that's interesting. We don't have any. I hired her, and she taught us to ask the right questions. And we had a lot. And she introduced me to a study that had been done by the Berkeley Research Associates, which was a pair of women with disabilities in Berkeley that surveyed 200 women who were leaders in the independent living movement and documented that domestic abuse, domestic violence was the #1 issue of those folks. A number of years ago, United Spinal did a survey of the women in their program and came out with the same result. The issue of domestic violence for women with disabilities, and we know as well, most of the people we work with are women, but we work with men with disabilities as well, is one of those issues that people don't think about. And I tell the story often about how I got involved because I never thought about putting disability and domestic violence together in the same sentence until my eyes were opened. And so in part, we're here to open eyes and give people direction for what can be done to do more for individuals. And I oftentimes say when we're doing intakes with individuals and programs, ask the question, have you been a victim of abuse? And go into what abuse means. Oftentimes people might say no on day one, but the card is on the table. We've raised the issue, and I've had people who I've worked with personally come back to me after the initial denial 3 months later and say, let me tell you my story. And so I think it's very important that as we're doing the work we begin to ask people questions about what they have experienced in terms of abusive practice. And we're going to be talking about that as we move forward. We've been doing the work since we started in 1978 as a federally funded research administration program, at that point known as Project Outward Bound, to work with newly disabled people. A lot of people who were new spinal cord injured individuals. And we were there originally to sort of do some pre-vocational work and to whisk them off into vocational rehabilitation. We were sponsored by a voc rehab agency. What we found is we had to do a lot more work in trauma. The communities we worked and lived in were inaccessible. Barely 20% of the sidewalks or the corners in New York City had curb cuts. There was no real accessible transportation to speak of. And living in the community was very much being in a hostile place. And so we worked with advocates on housing issues, on transportation issues, on a variety of issues to break down barriers in New York City, which led to our creating the name Barrier-Free Living, which is our goal. Not just about the architectural barriers, but about the attitudinal barriers, both externally within society and the attitudinal barriers that people can pick up because they've been taught that way, that's held individuals back from truly being in barrier-free living. I'm clicking, okay. The first domestic violence program we started was what's called a non-residential domestic violence program. I like to call it a community-based program because at one point I went to Albany to lobby for more money for non-residential programs, and an assemblyman said, "Why are we providing programs to non-residents?" They didn't understand what we were talking about. It's a non-shelter program. It's a program where we have offices in the community providing counseling, advocacy, groups, and a variety of things that individuals may need. We have a robust occupational therapy program in all of our programs. We had at one point an OT on our board who opened our eyes to the whole issue of activities of daily living and that being in the wheelhouse of occupational therapists. And we have been a training ground for hundreds of OT graduate students as they finish their master's degrees and as they go through 3-month internships like they would in a hospital or in other kinds of places. And we've had OTs from all over the country coming to our programs. Freedom House, our shelter, was opened about 14 years ago. It is the first totally accessible shelter in the country. As was mentioned, we've worked with people from 40 states, from Puerto Rico, from Jamaica. We had 3 Paralympians from Ghana who got off a plane at JFK and sought sanctuary in New York City and eventually ended up being sheltered by us for about a year and a half as they were applying for sanctuary, working with domestic violence lawyers as well as some high-powered lawyers from volunteer firms. What we discovered at Freedom House was that a certain portion of the people we worked with, not just people with disabilities, but others as well, did not have the skills they needed to be able to live on their own because we can keep people in shelter for 180 days, and after that they have to move on either to a homeless shelter or, if we're lucky, into permanent housing. And there were many people we worked with who were perfectly capable of doing those things without much help from us. But about 20% of the people we worked with really demanded about 80% of the attention of our staff in terms of adjusting to being a single parent, adjusting to living on their own. And that inspired us to look into doing supportive housing for survivors of domestic violence. We have 50 family units and 70 singles units. All of our families are, our disabled head of household is the category in supportive housing. that we use to be able to fund the program. And in our other program, mental health is the issue because there is no supportive housing just for people with physical disabilities who are singles. But we found that there were enough people with ongoing depression and anxiety that we could make the case for a lot of the people that we served. And we are in process now. We have just finished the demolition of our old building that had been a shelter for activity of daily living dependent homeless people. And we're going to be building 74 units of supportive housing on that site, with 44 of them going to families and individuals who are coming out of the domestic violence shelter system. So our objectives today: looking at the definition of domestic violence, understanding how trauma impacts decisions to stay or leave, accessibility and making requests to providers, safety planning, and then at the very end, providing you with some resources. But to start with, the definition of domestic violence. Oftentimes when people think about domestic violence, they may think about physical abuse or sexual abuse, but the real core issue of domestic violence is power and control. And one of the reasons why people with disabilities have a higher rate of domestic violence is they are seen as attractive victims, better able to be controlled by the individual who engages them in a relationship. And it's like putting a frog in a vat of cold water versus putting a frog in a vat of boiling water. The frog is going to jump right out when it's boiling, but if it's cold and it gradually becomes hotter and hotter and hotter, the frog will stay in and adjust to that until it dies. And often relationships start as, this is a knight in shining armor. This is somebody who's going to take care of me, to take care of my every need. I'm not going to need anybody else in my life. And that begins the pattern of coercion, which oftentimes is, I want all your time to myself. I don't want you to have that many friends outside of our relationship. I want you to spend your time with me. And that can sound attractive and somewhat romantic for some individuals. And gradually, over periods of time, more and more control takes place. And so if we look at the cycle of power and control, Duluth, Minnesota created the Duluth model for a circle of power and control, and we had done one as well that included people with disabilities. I think that was presented in the last presentation that we did. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because we want to have time for other things today. But the major issues, types of abuse: physical, sexual, incest, psychological, verbal, economic, medical, all are part of abuse. Control of children. If you leave me, you will lose your kids, is often one of the threats that a person with a disability faces. And oftentimes the psychological verbal can be more traumatic than the physical or sexual. I remember two sisters who came to us when we just had our homeless program open. And I say, by the grace of God, we had 2 empty beds when they called us because they were being sexually assaulted by their stepfather. And one of the 2 sisters had seen a program on Oprah about domestic violence and had called the police. And the police took them to Long Island Hospital, and a social worker at Long Island Hospital, knew about our program, and they ended up staying with us. My domestic violence team worked with them, and they spent more time talking about the psychological and verbal abuse, particularly the psychological and verbal abuse they'd experienced from their mother, than the trauma of being sexually abused by their stepfather. Sticks and stones and all that kind of stuff, they may not break bones, but they can have a major impact on a person's self-image in a person's life. And that is critically a part of the abuse that we end up working on. And that's a very important piece in what we do. Economic abuse. We have had people come to our shelter that didn't know they had SSI because they were coming from a place of abusive parents, and they didn't know what they had, and we ended up with the good news, bad news message. The good news is you have a source of income. The bad news is in New York City, it's $808 a month, and you've got to make it stretch. And so part of our training was, how do you budget yourself? How do you get the services you need? How do you get the other supports you need so that you can be economically independent in the community? The medical can be taking away an individual's wheelchair, taking away, it used to be TTYs, but adaptive equipment for deaf individuals, taking away the variety of things. There was a woman who came into shelter. She was a wheelchair user in a walk-up apartment, and her husband, her abuser, had to do all the shopping and had to provide for her because she couldn't get out to be able to do it for herself. And finally, people from her faith community convinced her to go into shelter because she really needed to have a life that wasn't so controlled by the individual who had control to the outside world. So those are the kinds of things we see on the abusive side of what we're doing. And we're going to move into trauma, and Cynthia's going to take over at this point.
Hi, everybody. This is Cynthia. I'm the Chief Program Officer at Barrier Free Living. I identify as she, her, hers. I am white, hearing, and able-bodied. So what is trauma? Some questions I'm often asked is, how does this relate to domestic violence? Why is understanding trauma important when we speak with survivors? And why is it even important to understand when we discuss safety planning? Sometimes I hear from folks that trauma survivors just don't get better, and that is absolutely not true. "75 to 85% of the survivors' potentially traumatic experience, they return to normal functioning in about a year or less after the experience. And this is important to keep in mind so we don't assume that people are broken forever after an experience of trauma. This can play into how we as a society have been taught to view survivors of trauma. So what is trauma? I'm just going to read the definition. The trauma is individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances experienced by the individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So let's break this down a little bit. Trauma can be a one-time event, such as a car accident, something that's just going to happen one time, we hope, in someone's lifetime. It could be a series of events, such as multiple incidents of domestic violence. Or it can be a set of circumstances. So an example right now is being isolated due to COVID. We're hearing a lot about people being affected and traumatized due to isolation. That's a circumstance in our society right now that's affecting them as an individual. And trauma is related to our experience of domestic violence, but it can also be related to the discrimination and the oppression that we experience as a result of a disability. So someone can experience all three of these, a one-time event, a series of events, circumstances throughout their lifetime, or they can experience just one trauma throughout their lifetime. It's really very dependent on that individual person. So what are some trauma triggers for people with disabilities? Paul mentioned and touched on this a little bit, that some individuals experience a history of being mistreated because of their disability. For example, being perceived as stupid or incompetent because you're deaf. Or in some societal views is that a person with a disability can't be a good parent because they're in a wheelchair. These are absolutely untrue, but these are how society views people sometimes. And that oppression affects us on a daily basis. Not being able to access services or being mistreated by staff within itself is traumatizing, such as not being able to make decisions for yourself when you go to a provider. Sometimes I hear providers say, well, we have a couple of stairs and that person can't get up or down them because they're blind. True story, heard that. Now, New York City shelters and buildings, they're old buildings. Not all of them accessible. Not all of them have a ramp or an elevator. But really what should have been asked in that situation is, there are 2 small steps. Do you think you can get into that community room? What do you think? Instead, people hear, well, there are 2 small steps to get into that community room. You can't participate. Being told no, you can't participate is traumatizing. The message being sent is you don't belong here. And as able-bodied people, we're making decisions for people with disabilities, and that's an ableist attitude. So really the key is asking the person to make the decision, if they can or do something or not, that we don't make the decisions for them. Sometimes people are denied services, and after being denied repeatedly, they have difficulty trusting people. They may be cautious about calling a family or a partner or just asking for help because you get told so often no. So you just stop asking. And people with disabilities often are not believed. Someone decides to finally confide and bring up this issue, that they're being hurt or they're in danger. I really urge you to listen to them and believe them, because they tend to stay in DV situations longer because people don't believe them or the lack of accessible resources available to them. So what happens is that they end up dealing with these traumatic situations for longer periods of time, and the forms of violence that they experience become more severe with time. So Paul's going to talk a little bit now about barriers to seeking safety and accessing services.
Statistics have shown that people with disabilities stay in abusive relationships significantly longer than the general population. And there are a number of reasons for that, one of which is lack of alternatives. Having no accessible shelter or having no programs where people can go to get help is a big issue. The issue of trust is an important one. And I basically said to my staff, why would you expect someone to trust us as they're coming into our programs? Because everybody who has in their lives who've said, I love you, from parents to partners, have betrayed that trust. And so there is a lot of sense of how do we earn someone's trust in providing for them. And so for us, part of that has been when people come into Freedom House of saying, welcome to Freedom House, we need a few pieces of information to get you registered in our system, and then come down tomorrow and let's talk about your needs. Because if we start where the person is at and begin to provide some concrete services, we can begin a long process of establishing trust. And it's looking at the policies that feel like they're controlling as well. When we started our shelter, a generous colleague gave us all of their paperwork, all of their procedures, their rules and regulations, the whole business. As we used them for a period of time, we saw a great deal of power and control that was being exercised over residents in shelter in the name of safety. Your children can't run. You can't let anybody know where you are. If you do, you'll be kicked out. And it was all done from a sense of threat. And what we've ended up doing is almost on day one, giving people information to say, here are safety considerations for you to look at and do your own evaluation of what you're doing so that you can be in a safer place with yourself or yourself and your children. And those safety considerations were developed with the wisdom of the groups of former residents at Freedom House, where we sat down and said, how do we define safety? And looking at it as safety of place, travel safety, electronic safety, financial safety, and relationship safety. And we did focus groups to spin out what does that mean for everybody involved. So all of that is important, that we're giving people information to empower them rather than laying down the law and saying you've got to act in this particular way and behave yourself as long as you're in our program. The issue of being triggered, you know, we do a lot of training with our staff because there are people who are traumatized by things that were done. At one point, we had a deaf maintenance man in our program, and one of our residents was trying to talk to him, and he didn't recognize her because he couldn't hear. And she ended up getting so upset with him that she ended up beating on his back. We had to train people to say, there are things that we have to do to be inviting. There are things that we have to do to be understanding, because oftentimes people can be triggered by things, and minor issues feel very much like crisis. An important piece of this that I think really needs more time is the bias of the child welfare system against parents with disabilities. A report, Rocking the Cradle, was put out by the National Council on Disability during the Obama years. And in the 400-page report, it went through the process of what the history of people with disabilities was and how the attitude of people about being parents with disabilities. And in many states, children could be taken away just on the basis that a parent was disabled, without even really evaluating parents' ability to take care of kids. And so when an abuser says, if you leave me, you will lose your children, there has been the weight of the child welfare system to back that person up. And part of what we've been about is to help people gain the skills they need to be parents, better parents, gain the skills they need to be independent with their activities of daily living, and to provide them with reasonable accommodation along the way in terms of our policies, practices, and procedures. So that when somebody comes to Freedom House, in most shelters, 20% of people leave in the first 2 weeks. Since we changed the way in which we do business, the way in which we treat people, hardly anybody leaves. And it's because we understand that a lot of what our system is about has been about power and control, and we have to actively resist that in order to provide accommodation. And that's part of the policies and practices and procedures part that allows individuals, whether people with disabilities or not, to be able to thrive in terms of looking towards a future where they are interdependent. I get in trouble with my friends in the independent living movement because I basically say there's no such thing as independent living. I'm not independent, you're not independent. I depend on my wife for some things, she depends on me for others. I depend on over 100 staff people at Barrier Free Living to do the real work of Barrier Free Living. I'm the CEO, and that's not what I do. And I'm dependent on the Metropolitan Transit Authority to get me to work. I am dependent on so many other people. But because I have networked those dependencies, I can have the fantasy of independence. And all too often, we expect independence of people who have been in dependent relationships. And for me, it's saying we need to teach people networking. So when parents get to know each other, everybody at Freedom House has their own apartment. There are times when one mother will babysit for another mother so they can go out and do shopping or do other things like that. At first, the way of doing business was they had to ask our permission to do that. And I basically said, no, we're working with adults. We're working to really reinforce that networking and that level of support from others, so that when they leave this place, they come with a different network of support than the family, which oftentimes has been tied too closely to an abuser. So for us, that's an important piece of what we do. And I think that's an important thing for us to consider in saying, how do we consider supporting people in readiness to leave? How do we support people in readiness to take off on their own? How do we give people cues to say, what's an abusive relationship? What is a healthy relationship? So that we're setting them up for success as they leave our program. Cynthia, I think you're doing readiness?
Yep.
Or is that me? Okay.
No, I am. So we got this question. What makes someone ready to leave their relationship? Leaving a violent relationship, it's complicated, it's messy, it's hard, but it's definitely worth it. Everyone has the right to be treated fairly and to be in a healthy relationship. Throughout the presentation so far, we've talked a lot about listening, and we're going to continue to talk about listening because it's so important. When someone decides to tell you that they're in a violent relationship, just be present with them. They may want to talk about it for 1 minute, 5 minutes, an hour, whatever they feel comfortable talking to you about, just be there. And let them know that you're there with them. So an example would be making eye contact if you're able to do that, so they know that you're there and you're listening. And sometimes when we're having these difficult conversations, it's okay to just be silent. You're not going to have all the answers. You're not going to know how to assist them all the time or what words to say. Silence is okay. And tolerate the questions. Problem solve with the person. Like I said earlier, ask the person how they're feeling, how they're doing, what's going to work for them. You may want to give some feedback. If you have feedback, that's okay. And recognize that it takes time. On average, it takes someone 7 times to leave a violent relationship before they do for good. So they might go back and forth, and this is very frustrating to people who are witnessing it or watching it from the outside, who see someone getting hurt repeatedly, coming and going. I hear that a lot. But continue to be there for them because it is messy, and it's really hard to make that decision to finally take that step and sever the ties. So some key strategies on if someone comes to you, what do you do? Speak calmly and clearly. Be with them in that moment. So for example, you can say calmly, I hear what you're saying. That sounds really difficult. Or you can say, I hear what you're saying. I just don't know what to tell you. That's very different. Because that's you showing frustration. That's going to shut the person down, and they're not going to continue the conversation with you. So listen with compassion. And check in with the person. I really hear that all the stress of what's going on is really affecting you. So what you're saying is, did I hear that correct? Make sure you understand what the person's saying, because when you're in a stressful situation, you may be saying things, but to the listener, it's not making sense. And that's okay, because you're under a lot of stress. So just make sure you're understanding what the person is saying. Highlight some protective factors for the person. And right now, this is really difficult in the COVID states because the people who were protective factors may not be there, so such as home health aides, schools, doctors, friends. So we might need to get a little more creative with the video chats. I heard a therapist say that they played an online game with the person that they served because for them, that's the way that they were able to chat with their therapist in a safe way, because for the abuser, she was just playing a game. So sometimes we need to get really creative thinking about what the protective factors in the person's lives are. And enhance empowerment through choice. Sometimes the choices aren't great, but that's the choice that's at hand, and talk through those choices. Don't press for details unless the person needs or wants to talk about them. They'll turn them away, turn them off. Let them share what they feel comfortable sharing with you at that moment. And again, use the survivor's words and join them, so make sure that you're understanding them properly and clearly. I'm going to touch a little bit on safety planning. There should be a handout available for download. We'll share that with you. So some things to consider when you're safety planning. How an abuser may engage the institution when a survivor is trying to leave. What does that mean? That could mean, Paul mentioned the child welfare system, that often parents with disabilities, they're seen in a certain light that because of their disability, they can't parent like an able-bodied person or a hearing person, and that's used against them. So they may engage the child welfare system. They may call in a case and saying they're abusive or they can't care for the child. They may use the court system or the police system. This is where the conversation has to come into play, and trust the survivor that they know themselves and they know their abuser and their relationship well enough. When someone's leaving, make sure they have all their medications, their prescriptions, the names and phone numbers of doctors and service providers that are helping them. People sometimes forget about their transit cards. These little details will make a huge difference at the end because it keeps people's day-to-day stability when they try to leave the relationship. And just thinking about how the abuser may exploit the person's disability. We see that in the violent relationship, and at times when the person leaves the relationship or thinking about leaving the relationship, that's the area that they will focus on. So preparing the person for these circumstances. And when we talk about safety planning, it's really a dynamic and ongoing process. It's not something you do one time. So you can do safety planning when the person is living with the abuser. You can do safety planning for the children in the home, safety planning when you're thinking about leaving, and safety planning after leaving. It's really an ongoing process. So continue to check in with someone throughout the process from when they think and recognize that, there's something going on here. I'm really not comfortable with it, to I really need to leave and it's time to go. And Paul's going to talk a little bit about Freedom House and the accommodations that we have at the shelter for someone who does want to leave, because we do take people from across the United States, like he mentioned earlier.
We have 44 apartments. A dozen of them are studio apartments because we know there are a fair number of individuals who are in need of shelter. At one point in time, we had over half of the studios in the entire New York City domestic violence shelter system. That since has been approved. And there are other programs that are accommodating single individuals as well. But every one of our apartments is accessible. You can see one of our apartment kitchens. We have a cooktop that is accessible so someone can roll a wheelchair underneath. The type of refrigerators we have are the type that have a freezer and a refrigerator side by side so that an individual can open the door and have access to either one of them, whatever the disability may be. Our hallways, it's hard to see from this, are 6 foot wide, so that two people in wheelchairs can pass each other easily and not end up in a traffic jam. All of our hallways have peppermint on the first 3 or 4 feet of the hall, and that is for protection. The number of people we work with who have motorized wheelchairs, there really isn't a driver's ed program for motorized wheelchairs. And they can do a fair amount of damage in the building. And so we have learned after our first building was built that it was important for us, the hallways and the areas around our doors are all done in what's called purple board. which is what's used in prisons, in gymnasiums, in places where there's potentially high stress on a wall. And we have Acrovin on top of that. And we have not had to repair a hallway wall in the 14 years that we've been in existence. And we've worked with a fair number of people in both manual and power wheelchairs. Our lobby is fairly large. We have a large multi-purpose room off the lobby. It's big enough for us to do Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas and Hanukkah holiday parties, and to do other kinds of events during the year when we're not beset by COVID. And that community space has been very important because one of the challenges we have found is people being away from home during the holidays, of Thanksgiving away from family, of Christmas or Hanukkah away from family, of New Year's away from family. And oftentimes I will talk to residents about family of choice. I had some good friends who had created family of choice for Thanksgiving because all of them came from families where there was a great deal of high drama over the Thanksgiving table. And rather than going back to biological people that were somewhat toxic, they chose to create new family configurations and creating new traditions of getting together as family of choice to celebrate the holidays. So they wouldn't be doing that alone. Because being alone at the holidays can be a seriously depressing thing to do. So part of the accommodation is about doing those kinds of things. If you look at the doors in our hallways, you will see there is dark gray around every one of the entrance doors. On every floor, we have a different color, a very bright color for the doors. And we do that so that if we're working with someone who has low vision, that they're able to navigate the system in a better way. Our signage has Braille as well as raised letters. And we have kits that we can use for any one of our apartments that is for individuals who are deaf, where we can put on a doorbell, an electronic doorbell that flashes a light inside the apartment. Every one of our apartments has a flashing light if the fire alarm goes off. If somebody has a seizure disorder, we have a form that they can fill out so that we can legally cover up flashing light in their apartment so they don't have a seizure when that happens. All that's very important because we don't have 2 units set aside for people who are deaf or X number of units set aside for somebody who's blind, whatever, because there's so much turnover in 44 units where people are staying for only 6 months at a time. We have to be able to accommodate anybody with a disability at any given time. We have a Hoyer lift in our OT space, and our occupational therapists teach people how to use that if they need that right away. If people come and have had to leave their durable medical equipment behind, we will work with them because it's been possible for us, if they get a court order protection, that we can get a police escort to go back to their home of origin and retrieve those things which are expensive and which, quite frankly, Medicaid isn't going to pay for a second time around. So that's all part of what's important for us. And we have some emergency wheelchairs if someone's breaks or if someone comes with a horrendous wheelchair that's in really bad shape. We had 3 Paralympians from Ghana who were superstars in the London Olympics, Paralympics. They met each other there. They shared the stories of trafficking, domestic violence, being treated as bad luck women, not being looked at or talked to by members of society, and then with the transformation with the Paralympics becoming superstars. They came to JFK. They rolled into a police station and requested sanctuary. And we learned about them the day before Thanksgiving. In the middle of Thanksgiving weekend, they became residents of Freedom House, and they lived with us for about a year and a half. While we were working with domestic violence lawyers and high-powered law firms who took the sanctuary case for each of the women involved and are carrying through with that even to this day. After a year and a half, their lawyers worked with us in making sure that they were in accessible space in a homeless program until they were able to get their legal papers so that they could get the kind of support they needed to be able to get rental subsidies and other subsidies to be able to live independently in the community. That's an important part. We have a nurse on staff, full-time, licensed practical nurse, and she's not there to give people injections or do medications or whatever as much as to be a nurse navigator. When people come in, they really can't go back to the hospital system, the medical system that they've been part of before, because that's the very first place that an abuser is going to look. The same with working with children who are in special ed. We have a liaison on site from the Department of Ed who has her office on our lower level, where she meets with every new family who's got kids and works on getting those children placed in appropriate schools within the community near us. Or if there's specialized need. We had, I think, a 3 or 4 year old deaf young man who came into the program, and he was in a specialized school, and there was only one other school in New York City that could provide him with a specialized education. We had to work and coordinate to get him into that other school, because the first place the abuser would look for that child would be special ed. And so that's been an important part of the kind of accommodations we've done. Like I said at the beginning, barrier-free living is not just about architecture. It's about lifestyle. It's about living. It's about providing a safety net around individuals and their families as they go through their time with us. And here are some resources. We're going to leave that on the screen and take a look to see if there are particular questions. Is Freedom House accepting any consumers at this time? Yes. As a matter of fact, we had a whole group of people who were with us for over 180 days, and a lot of them were swept out of Freedom House into either permanent housing or homeless programs. And I was at Freedom House today. We are right now licensed for 95 individuals. We have 78 in-house. You do the math, figure it out. One of the beauties of Freedom House, and I will pat myself on the back for doing that, is I learned from colleagues in the field when we were using our homeless shelter as a default DV shelter for singles, that many people felt they were stuck with apartments that were too static. So if there was an apartment big enough for a woman with 4 kids and that family left, did that program take in a woman with 2 kids and lose a per diem, which is, the amount of money per person per night that gets paid that floats the boat in domestic violence shelters? Or do they wait to see if they can find a family that has 1 in 4, as we would say, an adult with 4 kids? We've set up our program in such a way so we have 2-bedroom apartments next to flexible studio apartments. And if you've ever been to a Holiday Inn or most, hotels where there is a door that can be unlocked from both sides so you can share space, we have a bedroom between the quote studio unit and the 2-bedroom unit that can be used either way. So that if we have a big family that needs 2 bedrooms, they get the 2 bedrooms. If they're replaced by a family that's smaller, we'll lock off a bedroom and they'll have 1 bedroom. If they are a larger family, we will open up both those doors and they will have what amounts to a 3-bedroom apartment. We make sure that we turn off the electricity on the stove for the 3rd bedroom so children can't make mischief with it. But we leave the refrigerator in place because big families usually need big supplies of food. So that's all important stuff in what we do. And we're working with families of a variety of sizes, from singles to I think the largest we've had is a woman with 9 children.
A question came in about how do you get into Freedom House? So if you go to our website, which is www.bflnyc.org, there's a program page with all the phone numbers to each of our sites. Freedom House is 212-400-6470. You can call and see if they have any beds available for that specific family size. Like Paul said, it can be a single, it can be a mom or dad with 1, 2, 3 children. Every day the units turn over, so I suggest calling. And then they'll just ask you some questions, and then they'll do a screening to determine, one, is the person in immediate danger, and is the neighborhood that the shelter is in safe? That's very important, because we don't want to bring someone into the shelter and that neighborhood is unsafe. And then they'll discuss with the survivor themselves what that will look like coming into the shelter if they qualify, and any special needs that they have during that time.
Yep. We expect that by July, we will be expanding our bed count by 11. We literally have 130 physical beds in those units. We are licensed for 95. Because of demand, the city's come to us and as it has been working with us for a while now to expand to 106. So very shortly, we will have even more beds available. And we have the units because at 95, we oftentimes have empty units. And we want to make those available, particularly to people with disabilities who are in need. Because we are a licensed shelter in New York State, we have been told we cannot bar able-bodied people from coming into our shelter. Somebody has a need, and there's not a person with a disability that's ready to move into a unit, we have to issue that unit to someone who's able-bodied. And in some ways, it's a good thing because it creates the sense of this is not just about people with disabilities. There's a sense of networking among people with disabilities and people who don't have disabilities. And many of the people who don't have disabilities have children with disabilities. We worked hard to get our domestic violence hotline in New York City to ask questions about accommodation. And when they started doing this, by the time they'd done it for the 3rd quarter in a row, close to 45% of the individuals who were calling looking for shelter had a need for accommodation either for themselves or for their children. So we're aware of the great nature of need in terms of what we do.
There are a lot of questions coming in. I just want to try to answer all of them. We service everybody,
on quarantine.
Yeah, regardless of gender. Just want to say that. Men, women, LGBTQ, if you're in danger and need assistance, we're here for you. Child custody issues, if the person's seeking services from out of state. We just started a legal services department at Freedom House, so we have a lawyer on site for folks for, at a minimum, a legal consultation, and then the lawyer will guide from there depending on that person's very specific needs. There's a question that came in. How has the quarantine guidance changed your daily operations in regards to housing people in shelter? Has that decreased your capacity? Great question.
No.
Thank you. The answer is no, it has not decreased our capacity.
But one of the things that UN Women, Executive Director of UN Women, came out with a statement saying that the shadow pandemic is domestic violence, that individuals who are victims are being forced to shelter in place with their abusers. And oftentimes that means they don't have access to calling or access to communicating in other ways to be able to seek help. And we've seen at times our numbers go down, not because we don't want to take people, but because of the difficulties, the challenges that come for individuals to escape. We have worked with people who are in quarantine, who have had contact with people with COVID. We have one resident right now in isolation, and we are supporting her in terms of providing her with food. She's obviously not able to go out because she has COVID. We are working on coordinating medical support with her and the like, and we would anticipate doing that with any person or family that we're working with.
We're going to continue the presentation. A lot of questions are coming in, so we're going to go over the hour just so people know, so we can answer everybody's questions. Do you have any connections with hospitals? We do work with our local hospitals. There's only one in New York City that provides temporary housing until we have a bed available for someone who may be homeless. But sometimes we work closely with a hospital social worker because if someone really is in immediate danger and they can't go back to their home, they may not discharge them. They may admit them, for safety reasons until they're able to find a shelter. So a lot of this is working with our providers closely. I know a question came in about funds for people to get to us. We don't have funds for people to get to us if they're from out of state. But again, we work with our network. Like Paul said, the network's really important because maybe that other agency can assist with emergency funds to get them to us.
And there have been times when someone has waited until the first of the month when their SSI check has come and then used that to buy a plane ticket, a bus ticket, or whatever to get them to New York. And then we will coordinate the pickup of that individual to bring them to Freedom House. And we have stocks of food. We have a clothing pantry. We have a variety of things to help people settle in until they can get acclimated in New York and get registered for the kind of support they may need in our city. Let me tell you, one of the issues that came up in trauma, I want to tell you the story of one of our heroes named Teresa. She is a woman who was from Britain, a woman of color, a wheelchair user, came into our program because she was being abused by her husband and also by her adult children. And she came into our Secret Garden program seeking counseling. She had her own apartment by the time she came to us, otherwise she would have been in shelter. And for 8 years, she worked with one of our counselors. In that process, she got involved with a program in New York City called Voices of Women, which was formed by a friend and colleague to train survivors of domestic violence to represent, to make public, to make speeches, to testify before city council, to do a variety of things, to be the voice of battered women in the city. She joined that program. For a while, every time she made a presentation, she had to book an appointment with her counselor afterwards. But then she got to a point where she was able to do it on her own. She ended up as not only a member of the board of Freedom House, but the vice chair of that board until her untimely death from an apartment fire. But her picture is up in every one of our programs, cutting the ribbon on our supportive housing program, because she was one of the great advocates that pushed the city hotline to ask questions about disabilities, that pushed for accessibility for people with disabilities in the variety of systems within the city. And she became a giant in the field, but only after 8 years of our helping her get to that point.
Another question came in. Thank you, Paul, for that, because she was an amazing person, and we miss her. Mm-hmm. A question was, do we work with survivors who have various forms of addictions? At the shelter specifically, there's a state regulation that there's no alcohol or drug use to be used in the facility. However, we know that survivors use different methods to take care of themselves, and we recognize this. So If someone comes in and they disclose that they have an addiction, yes, we will work with them. The main issue to come into Freedom House is that they're in danger and the neighborhood that the shelter is in is safe. At Secret Garden, our community-based program, yes, we will work with someone who has an addiction as it relates to the violence that they're experiencing, but we do not have the specialty around addiction counseling or specialties around domestic violence counseling.
There are some shelters in the DV system that really specialize in that, and then the question is whether they're accessible enough for the particular individual. And there have been times when we have collaborated, where we have had, we've worked with Womankind, which used to be the Asian Women's Center, with a Chinese-speaking person with a disability, and they have come in and done the counseling and done a lot of the case management and worked with us on providing for that particular individual. And many times over a period of months, at least some rudimentary communication happens between a resident like that and others. For deaf residents, we have done, American Sign Language classes for our staff. We have deaf staff, and that's been an important part of our program. It was where we started 34 years ago, working with individuals who are deaf. And that's something that's, again, very important for us as well.
There's a question, do you allow smokers? As long as they don't smoke in the building, we're okay with that.
Right.
That's their choice if they would like to smoke.
That's right.
But they can't in the building because we do, one, it's against our regulations, but also we have people with lung conditions in the building, such as asthma and emphysema or more serious conditions than that. And we don't want to affect anyone's breathing who's living in the building.
Yeah.
Paul mentioned our deaf
we have
services
an area in
team.
our backyard. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Our deaf services team, we have a deaf social worker, a deaf case manager, and a deaf advocate. So, and that's at both our Secret Garden and our Freedom House program. Do we offer quit programs or strategies? We have a psychiatrist on site who does work with people who, if they want to quit smoking, we will definitely work with them on that. And we have social workers on site who can also assist, but that's not something that we, if someone wants to quit, that's fine. We will support them in that, but we won't, we understand that everyone has different coping strategies. Animals, yes, we allow service animals, not pets, but we do allow service animals. We often have service dogs at our facility.
And emotional support animals as well, within reason.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
We've had both. We raised up the issue about pets with our residents, with our community at one point, because there was a lot of interest in having pets in shelter. And because of allergy issues, because of other kinds of things, the group of people that we were working with at that point says, we understand the need for service animals and emotional support animals, but we need to draw the line someplace because there are people who have allergies to cats and allergies to a variety of other animals that may be coming into the program as well.
And we recognize that support animals are also abused.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
And that's another way to abuse the survivor is by abusing their animals. So definitely a support animal is fine. The bigger issue that comes into place is because the shelter short term is what happens after, because not all places are as accommodating.
Yeah. And to me, an important part of the issue of, like, do we have a smoking program, is there are smoking programs offered by the city, and there are other kinds of programs that people may need. And we want to encourage people to network, because the temptation often can be to transfer the dependency from the abuser onto barrier-free living. And if we're seen as the be-all and end-all of everything that a person needs, that can easily fall into a very dependent kind of situation. And for us to help people begin to see that they can network. I want to be in a smoke enders program there are programs in the community, let us get you hooked up to that program. If I want to be in an art program that's more than what we do with occupational therapy, if I want to take a class, if I want to do, whatever it may be, that there are other opportunities in the community, and we have networks that we've established over the years that we've been working where people can be referred for a variety of things to enrich their lives. And to me, the importance of that is critical. When we have situations where there are where there's need for family intervention or children intervention, we have a solid relationship with the Association to Benefit Children, which is a prevention agency to prevent foster care, to support families in staying together. And the beauty of ABC is that a family has to leave us in 180 days, but Association to Benefit Children can follow that family into the community as long as they are geographically in an accessible space where they're able to do that. And that, to me, is an important piece of it. So it's not that somebody's falling off a cliff when they reach their final day at Freedom House or feel like they're falling off a cliff, because there are other places within the community that they've established relationships. And we have also encouraged people to come to a transition group. We call it Beyond Freedom, where people can come for like the last 30, 60 days of their time in shelter and can come back as often as they need to afterwards and support each other in the process of moving from a safe, DV-oriented shelter space into places that may not have the same level of understanding. And that's been important for us to learn where there are bumps in the road in terms of systems. It used to be that we would have to send our folks to something called PATH, which was the Assessment Center for Homeless Families in New York City. And there is a domestic violence unit in PATH. And what I learned from sitting in on that group was the most traumatic part of the process of moving into the homeless system was having to sit with a social worker surrounded by their children, having to tell the story of their abuse because there was no child care available. I mobilized the domestic violence residential community and the Gender Justice Task Force to press for child care. And at the end of the day, those two coalitions worked with the city, and there is now a beautiful child care space right next to the space where the NOVA unit, which is the DV unit in Homeless Services, operates, so that children don't have to be traumatized or re-traumatized by having to hear that story themselves. And, we didn't get a plaque on the wall for barrier-free living because, again, for us, it was about interdependence and saying if we tried to take that on just on our own, we probably wouldn't have had the traction we had by going to coalitions.
There's another question regarding documentation. We do not require any documentation for support animals or disability. I was going to add to that question. We take people's word for it when they say they have a disability, what that is. We take people's word for it that animal is their support animal or emotional support animal. What we do encourage once they get to us, though, is that they obtain that documentation for the future because not everyone is as willing as we are, I'll say. Yeah. So like Paul's been mentioning, expanding people's networks, expanding our network is, I think, the key to doing this work. Because we can have a beautiful building that's completely accessible, and it is, and it is wonderful. But it really is the supports outside of the structure of the building what makes barrier-free living successful for the people that we serve. It's expanding those networks and connecting people so they can be independent in their own way.
And some of those networks are internal as well of women in our program, I'll just put it as women because that's the case in this case, who made a pact to get together once a month after they left Freedom House in a local Burger King. And they would sit and either just have coffee or have lunch together and support each other and keep up with each other in the community because that was, in essence, their family of choice that they had developed over the period of 6 months of working with people and seeing that their story and the stories of others were not that different. There were variations on a theme, but there were ways in which people could support each other, not just while they were in Freedom House, but after they went out into the community as well. And we welcome that. Have we missed any questions? Oh, by the way, one thing, the Federal Fair Housing Act, which basically covers more than the ADA. ADA speaks about specially trained, certified dogs for the most part. Emotional animals are not in the ADA. They are, however, in the Federal Fair Housing Act. Every shelter in the United States is covered by the Federal Fair Housing Act. Every shelter should be accommodating emotional animals. And all that a person should have to do is say, I have a disability, and this is my emotional animal. And all too often that doesn't happen the way it should. But that's the law.
I think we answered all the questions that were in the chat and the questions that came to the presenters directly. If anyone has any further questions, you can definitely reach out to us. You can go to our website. On the website, there's an info@bslnyc.org email address for general information, or Paul and my email, they're on the screen right now. You can feel free to reach out to us directly, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you for having us for this two-part series, and be safe. Bye-bye, everyone.
And thank you, Cynthia and Paul, for just a wonderful, really wonderful presentation today. Just want to remind everybody that a recording of this webinar will be available on the Reed Foundation's YouTube channel within the next week. There will also be a recording posted there from the first webinar. And you'll be getting an email with a link to the recordings of both webinars as soon as we have them. We will also include a link to the checklist that Cynthia mentioned earlier in the presentation. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us today, and take care.
Yeah. Thank you.